There are a lot of things you would normally consider when choosing a weapon to use, but in Arc Raiders, the game doesn't really give us that much to go on, as we get the weapon info in the form of unnumbered bars. So it's hard to know if you just think a gun is good or bad, or if it actually is. Now, like with most games, how you play the game will in large part determine if a gun is good for you and the way you play the game. So while there is arguably a lot of personal preference in the choice of weapon, it doesn't hurt to know how it statistically compares to others. So I've decided to go through pretty much every stat that we have currently available to us from testing within the community, so that we can statistically compare the weapons. There has also recently been some new info in regards to how shields and mitigation really works, and as I discovered making this video, the fire rates for the guns were in a lot of cases wrong, and I ended up retesting all of them myself. So I feel very confident that with this video, we can now fairly compare the real time to kill of the different weapons. After going through each of these stats, we will at the end of the video attempt some overall scoring and ratings of the weapons, but also try to find the best weapon for a given playstyle or category of player, whether you are looking for the PvP meta, or if you just want a more economic option as one of your teammates decided he was going to team lead for a night to your financial ruin. The data in this video comes partly from community resources, and people have put a lot of work in to figure out the stats of the different weapons, like the Anvil community, the Arc Raiders wiki, and various others, so a big shout out to all of them. But also from my own testing and experimentation, like I mentioned with the fire rates as well as some of the other stats. A lot of this info is still not nailed down, even the stuff I've tested myself, and is being further tested and revised, so don't take anything as the absolute truth. Things are always subject to change. I've also expanded upon these various stats by making my own or comparing across different stats, which has gotten us some interesting insights. I will also mainly focus on talking about tier 4 weapons, but I will include stats for tier 1 weapons where it's relevant, but I might not go as in depth on the tier 1 weapons in the essence of time. I've included detailed timestamps, so you should be able to jump around to the parts of the video that you find the most interesting. The Hullcracker is also mainly a PvE weapon and very unique, so we're not really going to look at that for this video, as its PvP viability is pretty abysmal for most scenarios. I've split this video into different categories: the damage, covering things like DPS and time to kill, the uptime, covering agility, magazine size, and reload vulnerability, the utility, which goes over arc penetration, moddability, weight, range, and stealth, and the cost, which covers the cost of buying and or crafting and comparing that to PvP performance of each weapon. And then at the end we have the overall, which is where we'll try to score the weapons overall and for the different playstyles. First up is the damage of a weapon. We'll look at the raw damage output and how it performs in PvP, and then later on we'll take a look at how they perform against Arc. So let's take a quick look at fire rate and damage being the two most important stats for us finding the damage potential of our weapons, before we move on to DPS, shots to kill, and time to kill. The Bobcat, despite being a purple weapon, has the lowest per bullet damage of all the weapons at just 6 damage. Now this is coupled with a very high fire rate though, which we'll see later. The highest damage weapons are the shotguns and the Jupiter being a legendary sniper rifle, and the shotguns obviously have the caveat of being very range dependent. Of the other regular weapons, if you want, the Osprey at 45 damage is the highest, and the Anvil and the Pharaoh are the second highest damage at 40 damage each. The Renegade also sits fairly high up at 35 damage. Now these are all lever action, breech loader, bolt action, or single actions, meaning these guns will deliver devastating damage in a single round, but as we're going to see later, they might not be the best for DPS. After that it drops down to the rest of the guns, which are mostly just fully and semi-automatic weapons. The Venator does 18 damage per shot, since it's supposed to fire 2 bullets at the same time, but the ammo count goes down 1 by 1, so I guess in the actual game and engine it's 1 bullet doing 18 damage, and the 2 bullets at a time part is just to make it sound cooler. Now one thing that will increase this damage quite often is getting headshots. The headshot multiplier is significant in Arc Raiders. A lot of weapons will have up to a 2.5 times headshot damage multiplier, meaning you do 2.5 times as much damage with headshots as you do with body shots. There are some exceptions like the shotguns, the Il Toro, and Volcano, which effectively don't have a headshot multiplier and does as much damage with headshots as they do with body shots. Now this does tell us that going for a center mass, where your target is the biggest, and trying to land as many pellets as possible is the best way to do a lot of damage with shotguns. Some of the higher tier weapons like the Bobcat, Patina, and Torrente have a 2x multiplier, but the Tempest has just a 1.5x multiplier. The Aphelian's headshot multiplier is unknown at the moment. I have not been able to find any good info on it, and I have not yet unlocked access to the weapon to attempt to test myself. So we are going to use 2x as an estimate, as that is the multiplier for the other legendary weapons. With the fire rates, I discovered that the fire rates that are floating around for the different weapons were different to the ones I got when I tested them myself. So I decided to retest all of the weapons. And this was done by recording gameplay of tier 1 weapons and then counting frames in editing software to calculate the time it took to fire a magazine worth of bullets, from the muzzle flash animation of the first bullet to the muzzle flash animation of the last bullet, then averaging this over 5 different takes to figure out the rounds fired per second, and from there calculating the rounds per minute. For some of the smaller magazine-sized guns, especially the semi-automatic ones, which are more vulnerable to varieties in fire rate thanks to the inconsistencies in mouse clicking, I did more than 5 takes, like with the Anvil for example. Frames and video aren't perfect, but that allows us to get a good average. Fire rate also has a huge impact, as it's one of the central stats in impacting a weapon's time to kill. For the fire rate, there is a very big spread. We have weapons from the 22 RPM of the tier 1 Pharaoh to the 1025 RPM of the Bobcat. The 5 to 700 RPM range seems to be the most populated with the fully automatics at tier 4, with the Torrente at 815 RPM and the Bobcat again just crushing it at 1025 RPM being the main outliers. Both the Torrente and the Bobcat don't get a fire rate increase from being upgraded though, so they have this same RPM even at tier 1. Same with the Stitcher, which is part of what makes the Stitcher so decent even at tier 1. Some weapons do see a big increase in fire rate from being upgraded, the biggest being the Anvil and the Renegade, which get 25% increased fire rate for every upgrade tier, meaning at tier 4 they have a 75% increase to their fire rate. The Arpeggio has a 20% increase per tier, also making upgrading it very powerful. The Venator used to have a 22-44 and at tier 4 60% increase in fire rate, but it recently saw a nerf in one of the first real balance patches we've gotten, and it's now reduced to 13% at tier 2, 26% at tier 3, and 40% at tier 4. So it's a chunky nerf, but 40% is still significant and well worth the upgrade, like we'll see later. The Patina, the poor Patina, has the worst increase of all at just 5% increased fire rate per tier, arguably making it questionable if the upgrades and the increase to fire rate is even worth the cost. As it is a purple weapon and is costly to upgrade, it is also the slowest automatic rifle at tier 4 by a decent margin at 345 RPM, barely beating out the Venator, which is a pistol that also does 18 damage per shot compared to the Patina's 14. The Kettle is actually very competitive on fire rate at 563 RPM, which is above the Rattler, Arpeggio, and Patina. Now it being a semi-automatic and being tested in a very static and ideal situation means that this is not necessarily a consistently achievable fire rate for most players in actual gameplay, and is reaching more towards the theoretical max. This will also be the case for other non-full auto weapons. You are likely not going to reliably manage that fire rate in an actual engagement, but it is technically possible, which is important to note for later in the video. It's also interesting that the weapons that get upgrades to fire rate from being upgraded are mostly in the lower half of the fire rates, even at tier 4, while the highest fire rate weapons have the same fire rate across all tiers. I had to use video footage from other people and count frames to derive the fire rate of the Aphelion, Jupiter, and Equalizer, so do keep that in mind, that they might have a slightly higher margin of error because video and frames are not perfect, especially 2 recordings deep. But the Equalizer is the fastest of all of them with a 500 RPM fire rate. This one I'm fairly confident is 500 as it's fully automatic and therefore it's way more reliable to get an accurate fire rate from video. The Jupiter at 22 RPM and the Aphelion at 133 RPM is a little bit more uncertain. The Aphelion as well is a 2-round burst weapon, meaning it doesn't feel like 133 RPM, it feels more like half of that, so 67 RPM roughly, since its fire rate on paper is raised thanks to that second bullet in each burst. There are also certain weapons that have their fire rate indirectly increased by other factors when they get upgraded. The Pharaoh being a breech-loaded weapon means its fire rate is increasing indirectly with its reload time reduction from being upgraded, all the way up to 40%. The Osprey as well has its fire rate indirectly increased by reduced bolt action time from being upgraded, all the way up to 60% at tier 4. As we now know the fire rate and the damage of the weapons, a very quick and dirty comparison can be done with damage per second, or DPS, which is the damage multiplied by the fire rate. For the tier 4 weapons, the Volcano, Torrente, Bobcat, and Tempest sit as the top 4. The Volcano being a shotgun, making this DPS only really manifest if you are using it up close, as shotguns obviously have quite a large spread, making it hard to deal the full damage at range. Very interesting to note the difference between the level 1 and level 4 Venator as well. Even after its nerf, it has a significant power jump, from middle of the pack at 63 DPS for tier 1 to 94.5 DPS and number 5 at tier 4. So very clearly still worth upgrading, even though it used to be the third highest DPS before the nerf. Guns like the Anvil and the Renegade also benefit greatly from the increased fire rate that they get from being upgraded, totaling a 75% increase. This means they're not far from doubling their DPS from tier 1 to tier 4. Being a single action revolver and a lever action rifle respectively, this also greatly helps their usability in close combat. Their DPS is still not great though, but they are very different use case weapons and are much more suited for taking jiggle peek fights at range to take advantage of their high per bullet damage potential. The Kettle actually reaches a 94 DPS and sits as the 6th highest DPS in the game, just behind the Venator, which is quite surprising. If we sort the weapons by their tier 1 DPS, then the grey weapons, like the Kettle, Stitcher, and Rattler, jump up a little bit further, as they all have the same DPS for every tier, so it shows that the other weapons are more dependent on upgrades to be competitive. The Bettina also gets beaten hard by about half the guns in terms of DPS, despite being a heavy ammo purple weapon. It even fully upgraded to tier 4 is only middle of the pack, being beaten by grey weapons both as tier 1 and tier 4. It doesn't even counter this by having a lot of damage per shot like the Anvil, Renegade, and Osprey does, as it does just 14 damage per bullet. Speaking of the Anvil, Renegade, and Osprey, even at tier 4, they provide a fairly poor DPS, but they, contrary to the Bettina, do counter it with some of the highest per shot damage in the game. Raw DPS can give us an idea of what weapons have the highest potential damage. Not just against players, but also against Arc, where it's all about getting a lot of damage in quick when shooting at an unarmored part or weak spot. DPS and fire rate is great at highlighting the strengths of guns like the Bobcat, Torrente, Tempest, and to an extent even the Stitcher, as when you are swinging on or getting swung in close combat, having a lot more bullets to help maintain a high DPS really helps, and it allows you a bigger likelihood of landing the killing shot before your opponent does, as you are delivering a lot more shots overall if you have the higher fire rate. But DPS is not a very good stat for how a weapon might perform where that is not the case. Damage is delivered by individual bullets after all, meaning it's delivered in stages. Therefore, another important stat for us to look at in terms of damage is shots to kill. Shots to kill obviously refers to how many bullets that are needed to down an enemy, and we can look at both body and headshots. Headshots are incredibly powerful in Arc Raiders because when you hit someone in the head, some of the weapons will do up to 2.5 times their regular damage. This makes the required shots to kill significantly lower if you can place your shots well. We'll look at shots to kill against different shields, light, medium, and heavy, even though medium is the most used shield in the game and therefore probably the most important. There are also no ways to increase the actual damage per bullet of a weapon in this game, so shots to kill is therefore the same for all weapons from tier 1 all the way to tier 4. For headshots against medium shields, the Pharaoh, Anvil, Osprey, and Jupiter all sit at 2 shots to kill if you can land all headshots. The shotguns, the Volcano and Il Toro, as well as the Renegade, sit at 3 shots to kill. Most of the other guns, being rifles, SMGs, or pistols, will sit at a higher number, from 4 for the Venator and 6 for the Bettina, all the way up to 10 for the Stitcher and 14 for the Bobcat. Going up against light or heavy shields instead move the shots to kill up or down a couple of bullets at most when it comes to headshots. This is also why I think these shields can sometimes feel a little bit unimpactful and like there isn't a huge difference between them, but when you look at body shots instead, this difference becomes more clear. So this again shows how important headshots are, and that if you are going up against someone who's good and who lands their headshots on you, the shield you are wearing is going to matter a lot less. We'll also look at shots to kill compared to magazine size a little bit later in the magazine size section, and specifically what happens to the shots to kill when we don't assume a perfect accuracy. DPS is great for measuring close combat and also unarmored damage against arc, while shots to kill is great for ranged combat when you are not just sitting there firing the gun at its max fire rate, but instead delivering deliberate shots. But when we then combine the shots to kill stat with the fire rate we found earlier, we get the time to kill. And this is probably the most decisive stat for the weapons in terms of head-to-head damage comparisons, as it's able to account for the damage and DPS, but also how that damage is delivered in stages thanks to shots to kill. And this will give us the most accurate idea of how weapons perform in terms of PvP, assuming you hit every shot, of course. Now for the time to kill, there was recently revealed that we may have been thinking about shield mitigation and effective HP wrong. So shout out to Aroctic for his video, I highly recommend you watch it. And it meant that I had to redo all the available time to kill data that we had, and this might have changed up some expected results. So I've retested the shots to kill, and combined with the new tested fire rates, we can find the most accurate time to kill of the different weapons with the info we currently have. For the tier 4 headshot time to kill, we are in for a not so big surprise, as the Venator is the fastest time to kill with all headshots, but a bit more surprising is the Grey Kettle being the second fastest time to kill. The Kettle needs 7 shots to achieve this time to kill, but the Venator does have the advantage of only needing 4, so even after its nerf, the Venator has the best headshot time to kill against medium shields, arguably by a good margin as well, as the Kettle is so reliant on a good trigger finger. The Volcano hits like a truck, so it places third, even with its lack of a headshot multiplier. The Anvil and Torrente are close behind, even though they are completely opposite ends in terms of fire rate. The Torrente is a very heavy gun, very cumbersome, so it has a trade-off the other top weapons don't. Here we also see the power of the Stitcher at 6th place. The Stitcher also remains this competitive in time to kill all the way from tier 1, which is insane that a tier 1 gun that you can craft for 6 metal parts and 6 rubber parts can compete this well. And that also goes for the Kettle. It has its same theoretical time to kill all the way from tier 1. It's just a lot more theoretical thanks to it being semi-automatic compared to the comfortable and accessible full auto of the Stitcher. Definitely shows why a lot of players, including myself, tend to fall back on the Stitcher a lot. The Bobcat, despite its ridiculous fire rate, places 7th with 0.76 seconds with all headshots against medium shields. It also has this time to kill even at tier 1, just like the Stitcher and Kettle. The Berletta follows at 0.77 seconds, with the Tempest and Bettina sitting at 0.87 seconds. The Renegade is surprisingly poor at 1.34 seconds time to kill, but the Jupiter, despite having only a 2-shot headshots to kill, have the slowest time to kill at 2.73 seconds. The Tempest, interestingly, is one of the worst automatic weapons besides the Equalizer, needing 0.87 seconds to kill with all headshots, which is almost the same as a Rattler, and that's not a good look. If we look at body shot time to kill for the tier 4 weapons, the Tempest is actually quite decent, placing second only behind the Volcano, which is a shotgun and therefore very range dependent. The Torrente and Bobcat also does very well. The Kettle and the Venator drops, as they get a lot of their power against headshots thanks to their headshot multiplier, which they are now missing out on. The Anvil also drops pretty hard from 4th to 15th, while the Renegade sits around the same placing. For tier 1 weapon headshot time to kill against medium shields, the Kettle actually tops, thanks to the Venator losing its 40% fire rate increase from tier 4. Although there is a drop in time down to the Torrente and Stitcher, they are also very strong performers here at 2nd and 3rd. The Bobcat sits at 4th place now thanks to it having its 10,025 RPM fire rate all the way from tier 1, same as with the Torrente, Stitcher, Kettle, and the Berletta. The Tempest is also very competitive here, but not as much as with body shots. The Anvil also loses its 75% fire rate increase, so it places in the bottom half as a tier 1 weapon. The tier 1 body shot time to kill is pretty much the same story as with the tier 4 body shot time to kill. The Volcano tops, the Tempest is 2nd, Torrente 3rd, Bobcat 4th, and Kettle 5th. The Venator drops further down though, again missing its fire rate increase from upgrades. When we look at the headshot time to kill with tier 4 weapons against heavy shields, the Venator is the fastest time to kill, yet again, even though it doesn't maintain its 4 headshots to kill and it now needs 5. The Torrente is also a strong competitor against heavy shields, and it passes a lot of the other weapons like the Stitcher and the Kettle, for example. The Bobcat also takes a hit as it goes from 14 to 16 shots to kill, meaning it drops down to 0.88 seconds time to kill. The Anvil also loses its 2-shot kill, so it drops quite far down the list, and the Renegade doesn't really change against heavy shields as it still needs 3 headshots just like against medium shields. And the Tempest does decent despite its disappointing 1.5 times headshot multiplier. With tier 4 weapons against heavy shields with body shots, there is the same top 5 as with medium shields. The Volcano, Tempest, Torrente, Bobcat, and Kettle. Placed a little bit differently, the Tempest is now at 4th instead of 2nd, the Torrente is 2nd instead of 3rd, and the Bobcat 3rd instead of 4th. The Kettle is still 5th, and the Venator is still 6th. With tier 1 weapons, the headshot time to kill against heavy shields sees the Torrente at the top. The Kettle is still strong with headshots, placing 2nd despite needing 2 more headshots to kill. The Bobcat and Stitcher are also close to the top, with the Tempest also performing quite decently here at 5th. The Venator does struggle a bit more at 7th place, going over a 1 second time to kill. The Arpeggio seems to not have performed particularly well across any of these stats, while the Rattler has performed above average, which is quite the opposite of what I expected. With tier 1 weapons and body shots to kill, we yet again see the same top 5 weapons, the Torrente, Bobcat, Tempest, Volcano, and Kettle, with the Rattler placing as high as 6th, which is its best placing this far. Of the other popular weapons, the Anvil, Renegade, and Venator again see a low placing amongst the tier 1 weapons. Against light shields, the tier 4 Kettle is just undisputed at 0.53 seconds headshot time to kill, chiefly thanks to its shots to kill dropping from 7 to 6. The Venator is close behind at 0.57 seconds, but the Venator still needs 4 headshots. The Torrente again is just a powerhouse. The Bobcat and Berletta do quite a bit better against light shields than they did medium, jumping up the list by a few spots, and the Stitcher keeps its exact same placing as against medium shields. The Anvil, despite its low 2 shots to kill, does get passed by a lot of the other higher fire rate weapons. The Renegade sees its worst relative performance against light shields, also thanks to it staying at 3 shots to kill and not seeing any reductions there. With tier 4 body shots, the El Toro just comes out of nowhere thanks to it needing 2 shots against light shields instead of 3 shots like with the other shields, and with the highest per shot damage in the game at 67.5, it takes the 2nd place behind the Volcano. So the shotguns are the clear winners here with body shots, thanks to having a 0.2 and 0.3 seconds shorter time to kill than the rest of the weapons. So if you're using green shields on Stella Mantis, that might be why you're losing to shotguns. When we look at the tier 1 weapon headshot time to kill against light shields, the Kettle, Torrente, Bobcat, Berletta, and Stitcher perform very well across the board, as they are some of the guns that have their same time to kill at tier 1 as they do at tier 4. The Rattler, though, at 6th place now, is apparently a real threat to light shields. Tempest and Venator also do okay, but not great. For tier 1 body shots, we see the return of the dominating fiver from earlier, with the Volcano, Torrente, Tempest, Bobcat, and Kettle as the top performers. The El Toro holds up, but it's missing its fire rate increase, preventing it from capitalizing on the 2 shots to kill. The Rattler sits at 7th place now with a faster time to kill than the Stitcher and Berletta at tier 1. Now, if we average the time to kill for all the weapons time to kill with body shots and headshots for all 3 shield types, we get this as their average time. The Volcano does really well as it has such good body shot time to kill across the board. The Torrente and Venator is really close though. The Venator is just below a second on average. The Kettle also shows up strong here, even besting guns like the Bobcat, Tempest, and Stitcher. Now if we average the time to kill just for headshot time to kill for all 3 shields, then the Venator wins, with the Kettle in a close second. The Torrente also not far behind. It's interesting to see how much better some weapons do thanks to their strong headshot multiplier. The percentage reduction in time to kill from tier 1 to tier 4 is also the same for all shield types, as while the times are different, the difference between them is the same. And this is because time to kill is really only changed by the guns having their fire rate increased as a result of being upgraded, as there is no other way to increase the damage output of a weapon in this game besides fire rate. There are plenty of other important stats that we can look at for a weapon though, besides just damage. Another big factor is a weapon's uptime, which is determined by magazine size and reload time, and these also make up the reload vulnerability, which we'll get to in a little bit. But first we have a stat called agility. Now agility, after doing some testing, seems to affect two things, the ADS speed of a weapon and the weapon swap time. There is no perceivable difference between the weapons in terms of anything else that it might have been likely for a stat called agility to have an impact on, like running speed, sprint speed, climb speed, roll speed, or anything like that. It doesn't affect the ADS movement speed either, just the ADS speed itself. I did some testing to confirm the relationship between ADS speed and agility, and it seems to be somewhat accurate. It's hard to get a consistent measure of ADS time as the camera animation end is not really reliable, neither is the crosshair animation, so it's kind of hidden when you are actually ADS'd, and every weapon behaves a little bit differently. These shotguns have huge reticles, for example, and it makes it hard to judge when you are actually fully aimed in, as we don't have any scopes or sights to see through like a first-person shooter would. The weapon swap time is also two-parted. The agility of both weapons matter. So the agility of the weapon that you're swapping from matters for how fast you holster it, and the agility of the weapon you are swapping to matters for how fast you unholster that one. So swapping to a Pharaoh from a Torrente will be slower than swapping to a Pharaoh from a Berletta, for example. So because ADS times and weapon swap times even more so seem to correlate well with agility, although not perfectly, we are just going to score the weapons on their agility stat, instead of the ADS time or weapon swap time for each weapon, as it would take a lot more testing to find accurate values for these, to put it lightly, so that's a video for another time. And also in case of there being some other thing that agility affects that I'm not catching. The Berletta does top on agility and it does have a snappy and quick ADS, so do the other pistols, the Venator and Hairpin with a score at over 70. The Stitcher is also really high and scores basically as well as the Bobcat. The Anvil sits a little bit lower at 69, and then there is a step down to the other rifles sitting in the 40 to 60 range. The Volcano has a better agility score than the Il Toro, which, while it's hard to judge with the shotguns, seems to be the case that its ADS time is slightly quicker. The Osprey sits quite low at 45.9, its ADS time is also hard to judge as it has a scope, and is technically ADS'd into the scope after half a second, but it takes a whole second until the scope is fully settled, and the full ADS animation is completed. The Pharaoh loses on agility with 32.1, and I tested its ADS to be around 1 full second. The legendary weapons have pretty bad agility scores as well, which seems to hold up with their ADS speed not being the best either. The magazine size of a weapon is incredibly important in arc raiders, which makes the extended magazines very powerful, especially with high fire rate guns where you can quickly waste a lot of bullets if you're off target. Now, some weapons also have the huge disadvantage of not being able to equip extended magazines at all, like the Bettina, the Rattler, Pharaoh, and Anvil. Also the legendary weapons, because they can't be modded at all, but it's less of a big deal for them. So the heavy ammo weapons and the Rattler have this as a common disadvantage. Couple this with some weapons not having enough bullets to kill an enemy in a single magazine, and you are in troubled territory. The shots to kill of a weapon, especially body shots exceeding the magazine size of a weapon, is the big problem for the level 1 and level 2 Rattler, where it won't have enough bullets in a single magazine to kill a medium shield enemy with body shots without having to reload, making you dependent on hitting a high amount of headshots. Even against light shields, the level 2 Rattler needs to hit every single bullet. Even the level 3 and level 4 Rattler might still struggle here, as it needs 15 body shots to kill, and the level 3 has 18 rounds in a mag and the level 4 has 22, meaning there is not a big margin for you to miss your shots. The Berletta also has this problem at only 12 rounds base magazine size, but contrary to the Rattler, the Berletta can use extended magazines, which takes care of this problem, where even just a level 1 extended mag gives it a 17 round magazine size, making it in theory even able to take out a heavy shield enemy in one magazine. The Stitcher and Bobcat also has this problem with 20 rounds in their magazine baseline. That's only just enough to kill a light shield with all body shots, but similarly to the Berletta, they can have their magazine size increased by extended mags, which fixes this problem. Even though they will, even with an extended mag, as you'll have a hard time landing every single bullet, run out of ammo before killing an enemy more often than certain other weapons. The Venator, while not technically going past the magazine size with its shots to kill, it is borderline, so it will benefit greatly from using an extended magazine. Something interesting that we can do now is to adjust the shots to kill against medium shield for a 60% player accuracy. That might sound low, but it's actually fairly generous to assume that the average player hits 60% of all their shots. But if we assume that, we can look at the magazine capacity again, and we can see that weapons start struggling with their magazine size in a much more realistic situation, where instead of hitting every shot, we hit 60% of them. We can see that about half the tier 4 weapons go past their magazine size the moment we assume a 60% accuracy. Some weapons still have enough bullets, either just barely or even in surplus. The Jupiter and Aphelion have just enough, the Equalizer has more than enough, just like the Torrente, which is no surprise as they are both LMGs. A lot of the other guns have only one or a few bullets to spare, like the Tempest, Volcano, Bettina, and also the Renegade, Osprey, Toro, and Arpeggio. So the moment we don't hit every bullet, a lot of the tier 4 weapons start struggling on magazine size. Some of them really struggle, specifically the Berletta, Stitcher, and Bobcat, all needing 10 or more bullets to fix their magazine size problem. But a lot of the weapons can use extended magazines of various sizes, like we mentioned earlier, and if we look at which weapons can fix this problem with extended magazines, then there are only a few that can't. The ones that can't being the Bobcat, Pharaoh, Rattler, and Anvil. The Bobcat is past the magazine size by 2 bullets. Now this 60% accuracy doesn't account for fights at different ranges, meaning that a Bobcat in close combat could have a higher than 60% accuracy, making it perform a lot better. Also, if you are in close combat, hitting more headshots, this would likely also fix the problem. So if we assume a 60% accuracy, but also a 50% headshot rate, the shots to kill again will look a little bit different. And by the way, this might be a little bit confusing, but this is the total amount of shots fired in order to land a kill. So for an Anvil, it says 5 shots to kill. That means it needs to fire 5 shots on average to land the 3 shots needed to kill, 1 headshot and 2 body shots in this case, as it would on average take you 2.67 shots to kill with an Anvil if you land every shot, with 50% headshots and 50% body shots, but it would take you 4.44 shots fired with a 60% accuracy, which rounds up to 5. I hope that made sense. So if we look at the total shots to kill, half headshots, half body shots at a 60% accuracy, and compare that to magazine size, then for the tier 4 weapons without an extended magazine, the Berletta, Stitcher, and Bobcat still have too few bullets. Some just barely, where this problem can be fixed by using even just a tier 1 extended magazine, and then the Bobcat needs at least a tier 2 extended magazine. In fact, when we upgrade the weapons to tier 4 and we give them tier 3 extended mags, every single weapon has enough bullets to kill an enemy with a single magazine, although some, like the Bobcat, just barely scrapes by, the only exception here being the Pharaoh. The reload time of a weapon is in and of itself a pretty shallow stat that is also very situational, so the way I think it's more interesting to look at reload time is in relation to your fire rate and magazine size. If you have a small magazine, a high fire rate weapon with a long reload, you will be very prone to long reloads, and therefore vulnerable to getting caught in the middle of a reload, as when you can't fire back is when you are the most vulnerable, regardless of the weapon you are using. Even a Pharaoh is a threat when cornered with a bullet in the chamber. So I've made a stat called Reload Vulnerability. Now the weapons that score high on this are more likely to have to reload, and also have a longer reload, making you more vulnerable when using them. The Rattler loses this by a mile, and that is mainly due to its very long full reload time. Now the Rattler, just like the Renegade, Anvil, and Toro, all reload bullets 1 at a time, or 2 at a time in the case of the Rattler, and they can interrupt their reload to fire, meaning they don't have to sit through the entire reload, but you will still be in a reload animation more often, so these weapons are kind of in a category of their own. The Bobcat is really high up and very vulnerable, mainly thanks to its very high fire rate and its low base magazine size. The Stitcher, Kettle, and Bettina are also fairly vulnerable. The Stitcher is exactly like the Bobcat, low base magazine size, but not quite as high of a fire rate. The Kettle has a very long reload, even at tier 4, and so does the Bettina at almost 4 seconds. The Hairpin, Osprey, and even the Il Toro places pretty well here with a low reload vulnerability, and that's mainly because these weapons have a very low fire rate. But that is making them vulnerable in other ways, as if you fire very slowly, it might not help that you aren't in a reload. So if we compare reload vulnerability to fire rate, so we reward a low reload vulnerability and a high fire rate, then we see the strong points of guns like the Torrente, and to a lesser extent the Bobcat, Tempest, Arpeggio, and Stitcher, as these guns are able to shoot a lot more bullets with a better uptime, meaning they will feel more like a continuous threat, as fire rate has a sort of suppressive effect to it. These weapons will be able to fire bullets more continuously than a Pharaoh or an Anvil, for example, where there is a lot more time for someone to take an unpunished shot at you between each bullet that you can fire. Now, if we introduce extended magazines for the tier 4 weapons, then we see some changes to reload vulnerability. The Rattler is still just ass, but the Bobcat is performing way better, so is the Stitcher, the Kettle, and the Berletta, all of which are light weapons, and this is because the light weapons have the biggest extended magazines with up to 15 bullets. The medium weapons do have 12 bullets from their tier 3 extended mags, so they're not far behind. The Venator, for example, performs way better as well with an extended magazine. We can also look at the combined performance of weapons in reload vulnerability and time to kill, to get an even better idea of which weapons will have the best uptime, coupled with the best damage output in a firefight. The Osprey actually takes the top spot here, being a relatively slow fire rate weapon, with a big magazine and a relatively fast time to kill. The Torrente as well sits at a good score here, so does the Anvil and the Equalizer, showing that these might be the weapons that have slightly less of a risk to using them, while maintaining a competitive time to kill. We know that the Torrente is even one of the fastest time to kills in the game, and the Venator, being the fastest time to kill in most situations, aren't far behind the Torrente. So these are the safest weapons to use, arguably, as other weapons might have a better time to kill, but are more risky to use in terms of getting caught out reloading. That some of the weapons load their bullets individually does relieve some of the vulnerability of having to reload, and you would in theory even have an advantage if you could reload the one extra bullet you needed to finish the kill without having to go through a full reload animation to reload the entire magazine in one go. But there would be a difference between the weapons here, because of their per bullet damage, as weapons like the Renegade can do a lot with a 1 or 2 bullet reload because it's 35 damage per bullet, while guns like the Rattler will not be able to do quite as much. So if we look at reload vulnerability and bullet damage, we can see that the Osprey has a lot of damage relative to its reload vulnerability. The Toro also does pretty well here, with the Renegade and Volcano placing below the Osprey and Toro, but beating out the Anvil and the Rattler. And the Rattler, yet again, performs very poorly, showing exactly what we talked about, that some weapons can deal with being more vulnerable to reloads, especially if they load bullets individually, by being able to do a lot of damage with each of the bullets loaded. But the Rattler can't even make up for its vulnerability with per-shot damage. There are certain things we don't have any accurate or detailed information for yet, like the real recoil and dispersion values of the different weapons, which is a shame, as recoil and dispersion is a significant part of a weapon's performance, and I would have liked to include it in detail. We do have the stability stat for the weapons, but this stat is very broad because of how it seems to mix both different types of recoil, vertical and horizontal, as well as dispersion, as it doesn't tell us if the weapon has low recoil or low dispersion, or both, or low dispersion, high vertical recoil, and low horizontal recoil, etc. Like, for example, the Torrente has a higher stability score than the Bettina, and is on par with the Berletta, which makes it quite unclear what specifically it's describing and how relatively it is describing it. Also, the game doesn't account for improvements in stability from upgrades, so a tier 1 Stitcher and a tier 4 Stitcher has the same stability rating, even though the tier 4 Stitcher has 50% less horizontal recoil. Another example is the tier 1 and tier 4 Bobcat, also the same stability, even though the tier 4 Bobcat has a 45% reduced max shot dispersion and a 45% reduced horizontal recoil. So because the stability score doesn't account for upgrades, we can't know the real stability of the tier 4 weapons. And even though stability does include improvements from attachments, the attachments give recoil or dispersion reductions, but we don't know the relationship between recoil, dispersion, and stability, which means we can't even calculate our way to the actual benefit, as just looking at the bar would be far too inaccurate to be fair, at least in my opinion, and even then it's all dependent on what attachments you use and the combination of said attachments. So we will take a quick look at stability for the sake of it, but I'm not going to spend any more time talking about this stat because it is, in my opinion, way too broad, way too inaccurate, and it's not giving us a good objective statistical view of the weapons. We are therefore also not going to include stability in the overall scoring because it just muddies the results, to be honest, and it doesn't really provide any good insight. As the community haven't been able to test its way to more detailed numbers yet, or data mine their way to it, we can't really get any good info out of this stat for tier 4 weapons. And it doesn't even tell us a lot about a weapon's specific strengths for even the unmodded tier 1 weapons, where we do have an actual numerical stability stat. So I'll end up probably making a recoil video as a bit of an expansion to this one, when and if that data becomes available to us. The hairpin tops the stability score, low caliber suppressed pistol, so this makes sense. The Osprey has a very high stability as well, but sees little use from it, at least I would think so, as it's a bolt action rifle, and it should have quite some kick, so this is another reason why I think the stability stat feels a little bit inconsistent. The Aphelion and the Equalizer are both very high, which is interesting as the Equalizer I can see, but the Aphelion has some pretty decent recoil per bullet in its 2-round burst. So it seems weird that it's scoring higher than the Equalizer. It also isn't unlikely that the stability stat maybe also to some extent considers the fire rate of the weapons, as there are some certain indications it does, like with the Bobcat, the Stitcher, and to an extent the Torrente. But then there are some indicators that it might not, like with the Tempest. Overall, I'm not going to dwell on this stat very much, but now we know how the tier 1 unmodded guns rank on stability. The weapons in Arc Raiders also have different arc penetration levels, as people are mostly very well aware of at this point, and this means that heavy ammo guns like the Anvil, the Bettina, and the Pharaoh are significantly better at dealing damage through arc armor, meaning they also tend to deal with arc more efficiently in general. And while if you know where to shoot to hit unarmored parts of the arc, this isn't quite as big of a disadvantage for the medium and light weapons as you would think, it is still undoubtedly an advantage with higher arc penetration. There are 5 different arc penetration levels: very weak, which is light ammo, weak, which is shotgun ammo, moderate, which is medium ammo, strong, which is heavy ammo, and very strong, which is exclusively energy ammo and the legendary weapons. The most useful thing to look at here in terms of arc damage is arc penetration compared to DPS. And while the arc probably technically has a shot to kill, it's not something I'm going to try and figure out. So if we compare DPS to arc penetration with arc penetration scaled from 1 to 20, we'll try to adjust the penetration advantage to be very much in favor of the higher pen, and this is because the arc armor seems to absorb damage if it's not sufficiently high penetration ammo used against it. So to not let the very weak penetration and high DPS weapons rely on their DPS too much, we've weighed the penetration levels differently. As once the armor is shot off the arc, then we can just look at the raw DPS for the best damage against arc. It's kind of that simple. We can see the Aphelion and the Equalizer are performing well as the legendary weapons. The Jupiter not so well though, as its DPS isn't really very good. It does make up for this by effectively being a hit scan weapon, having instant bullet travel. Of the non-legendary weapons, the Bettina and the Torrente is performing very well, followed by the Tempest and the Venator, meaning the medium ammo weapons are holding up pretty well. The Volcano and Arpeggio being next, the Volcano, despite its weak arc penetration, does have the highest DPS in the game. The Anvil, being many people's go-to arc weapon, does not actually have the greatest DPS, but its high damage per shot and its strong arc penetration makes it great for dispatching with light arc enemies, the flying ones especially, in a couple of quick well-placed shots, same with the Pharaoh. But if you are going for pure DPS against arc, it's maybe not the best. Like for example when you're trying to damage through the armor of the bigger arc enemies or shooting exposed weak spots, like you are when you are taking down a queen or a matriarch. Guns like the Bobcat, Stitcher, and Berletta, despite having bad arc penetration, might still be okay weapons against unarmored bigger arc, when you are just dumping rounds into an unarmored exposed area. But because of their low arc penetration, they are weak alternatives for dealing with arc overall. Now, if we compare the arc penetration to the per shot damage, we can weigh the penetration 5 times the per shot damage to really emphasize the penetrating damage from a single shot. Then we see the Jupiter, Anvil, Pharaoh, and Aphelion really perform well. Keep in mind that the Aphelion is also a 2-shot burst, so if we had counted both of those shots as a single hit, it would place even better. The Osprey and Renegade also perform very well, so does the Toro thanks to its just massive per shot damage, but it is a shotgun, making it in practical terms perform a little bit differently. When we look at the weapon's moddability, it's quite hard to give a specific statistical score to it, because everyone likes to mod their weapons differently and according to their own playstyle. It's wrong for me to just decide that dispersion is better than recoil, for example, which it is, but it also greatly depends on how you play and what gun you are using. So instead, we'll score them based on how many options the player has for modding the weapons the way they choose. So grip slots allow you to mod recoil, and you do have the choice between vertical and horizontal, so these slots get 2 points. Stocks can adjust both recoil and dispersion, either both at the same time, or they can mod ADS time instead, like with the purple padded and lightweight stocks, but they can also mod fire rate with the legendary stock, meaning stocks get 3 points. Muzzle device slots can mod both recoil and dispersion, but they can also be used for silencers, making them as well score 3 points, besides for shotguns, which can only use chokes and suppressors, so 2 things, meaning 2 points. Magazines score for 2, even though they can only mod 1 thing. It is a very important thing, as we've seen from the uptime part of the video, and how impactful it is on a weapon's ability to kill. So a Stitcher, for example, and the Bobcat, which would be the same, as it has 4 mod slots, muzzle, grip, mag, and stock, it has a total score of 10. The Venator has a grip and a mag, so that's 2 points for the grip and 2 points for the mag slot, totaling 4, and so on and so forth. When looking at the results, the Bobcat, Stitcher, and Kettle score 10 points for the light weapons, where the Osprey and Arpeggio score 10 for the medium weapons, meaning these are the most moddable and customizable weapons, allowing the player to tailor them more to their playstyle. Following that is the Il Toro and Volcano with 9 points, as they can only mod 2 things with their muzzle devices, thanks to being shotguns. The Renegade, Bettina, Rattler, and Torrente sit at 8 points, while the Tempest is down at 7 points, thanks to it not having a stock slot. Despite the Rattler placing relatively high here, it is still missing its arguably most important mod slot that would fix its biggest problem, which is the ability to use an extended magazine. The least moddable weapons are the legendary weapons, as they cannot be modded at all. Besides them, the Hairpin with only a magazine mod scores the lowest. It is integrally suppressed though, so I guess that's something. The Venator is one of the strongest weapons in the game, despite only having a mag and a grip slot, meaning it's one of the most unmoddable weapons. But this explains its popularity even more, I think, as it can perform as well as it does, and it doesn't rely on being heavily modified with attachments to do so, as it can't be modded very much at all. So the moddability doesn't really tell us a lot about the weapon's performance overall, at least not until we get some real numbers for the more hidden stats in the game. Another thing we can take a quick look at is the weapon's weight, and I think this is really relevant in the sense of how much firepower do you get for a certain weight. The tier 4 Venator, even after its nerf, is still one of the highest DPS weapons in the game, as the 5th highest, with a also very low and competitive time to kill, the best in certain situations, and it weighs only 5 kilograms. I'll use kilograms, even though it doesn't say it anywhere, it just feels more right, you know. And the weight really matters if you're going for loot, same with the Stitcher. Yes, it does hit a little bit lower on DPS and time to kill than the absolutely best weapons, but it weighs only 5 kilograms and is dirt cheap to craft at tier 1. Now, if we compare the weight to a combined score for the weapons in terms of their DPS performance, so if we score them from 0 to 1 on DPS, damage per shot, and time to kill, and then divide that by 3, we get a overall normalized score for the weapons. This we can then compare to the weight of a weapon, and we can see the overall firepower relative to the weight. And we have 5 clear winners here, which is the Venator, the Berletta, the Anvil, Stitcher, and Volcano. The Venator being the real winner, with the best ratio of all of them, the Berletta being the lightest at 4 kilograms and the Volcano is the heaviest at 8, while the other 3 sit at 5 kilograms. Now this is the unmodded weight, so modding the weapons will add some extra weight, but at a base weight of 4 you are getting a lot of firepower with a Berletta. And this is another little point for the Stitcher here as well, showing that for such a cheap weapon, you are getting a lot of firepower in a lightweight package, making it a good choice for loot runs. In regards to the ranged performance of weapons, there isn't that much data on this. So while the wiki, for example, has a numbered ranged stat taken from the in-game weapon details, it also doesn't explain what that stat entails. Now, just from playing the game and from what I recall from dev Q&As, there is very little to no damage drop-off on the weapons. It's mainly just inaccuracy and dispersion. And this does seem to be the case. I have not been able to detect any noticeable drop-off for bullet damage, but even if there is damage drop-off and the range stat does include it, it doesn't really change our results any, and it's just a welcome bit of extra insight. I think the range stat might instead just be a scaled stat that is meant to indicate how well a weapon performs at range. It's probably just based off the bullet drop, how flat the bullet travels, the bullet velocity, how fast the bullet travels, as well as potentially the accuracy of a weapon. Stats that I don't have access to. So for the sake of curiosity, we can look at how weapons rank on the range stat. Even though it's not going to tell us anything concrete about the factors that make up this stat, it might give us a relative comparison of the weapons and their ranged performance. The legendary energy weapons have some of the best range stats in the game, not surprising as they have next to no bullet travel, next to no bullet drop, and are either a zero recoil beam or a sniper or battle rifle. The Osprey does top the list though. I don't know if it should be beating the almost hit scan like energy weapons, but it does have a really high bullet velocity and it is really accurate, so I guess I'll believe it. It also does have the advantage of being the only scoped weapon, as the Jupiter and Aphelion don't have a scope. Neither does the Renegade, which performs about the same as the Equalizer. The Rattler, for some reason, is doing surprisingly well here, beating out the Tempest, Bettina, and Arpeggio. The Anvil sits just below the Bettina and Pharaoh as the two other heavy weapons. The Kettle is the only gun that can have its bullet velocity increased by being upgraded. Other weapons need to use the extended barrel attachment to increase their bullet velocity, which makes it the only gun that might improve its range stat by being upgraded. There is also another little stat that we can look at, like the stealth stat, also from the wiki. Now this seems to be based on audio, and I would assume how far this audio carries to be heard by players or ARC. The Hairpin obviously wins, scoring at 70 with its integral suppressor. Interestingly, the Kettle scores the best of the rest of the weapons, probably thanks to its lower bullet velocity and therefore it making less sound when shot. The Berletta and Bobcat also don't do terribly, thanks most likely to the light ammo and the relatively lower amount of sound they make than medium or heavy ammo weapons. A lot of the rifles sit at 14, like the Tempest, Bettina, Arpeggio, and Rattler, and the worst performer is the Torrente, scoring just 1, in addition to the Equalizer at 0, as it doesn't have a stealth score. It's that bad, presumably. So the stealth stat seems to be impacted in large part by the type of ammo you are shooting and the fire rate you are shooting it at. Another useful thing for us to consider is the cost of these weapons, both in terms of buying them when that's possible and also in terms of crafting. If we look at the cost of buying weapons versus crafting one when both those options are available, it costs 3 times as much to buy a weapon as it does to craft it, so it's a good idea to craft whatever you can craft. Less than half of the weapons in the game are available for purchase from the traders, and that is mostly restricted to the worst quality weapons, like the greys, the greens, and one of the blues. And the scale in price is according to their quality. A standout here is the Berletta, which is available at a relatively cheap 8700. The Berletta also has its best time to kill available all the way from tier 1, as upgrading it doesn't affect fire rate like it does a lot of the other weapons. It instead reduces the reload time and increases durability. This means you can buy a tier 1 Berletta and have the same time to kill as a tier 4 Berletta. You can then spend some resources crafting or buying extended magazines for the Berletta, solving its magazine size problem, and you got yourself a pretty decent cheap weapon that, like we saw in the weight section, has quite a lot of firepower at the cost of very little weight. Just make sure you kill your enemies in a single magazine. We can also see what weapons actually have an improvement in their time to kill from being upgraded, which are just over half the weapons, and the ones that don't see an improvement is the legendaries, the Bobcat, Tempest, Torrente, Berletta, Rattler, Kettle, and Stitcher, which all stay the same time to kill for all tiers. If we compare the cost of both the tier 1 and tier 4 version of the weapons to their normalized time to kill, DPS, and damage score, we get some pretty interesting results. Firstly, we can see that it almost entirely follows the quality of the weapons, and this makes sense as the weapons are fairly closely balanced on damage across their qualities. But the lower quality weapons are substantially cheaper, and this seems to very much be a design decision by the developers, that you can not just spend the most money on weapons and therefore have the advantage over everyone with a lower quality weapon. The downside to this is that the higher quality weapons, generally speaking, perform quite poorly relative to their cost, making it feel like their performance don't really reflect their quality and the money that you spend on crafting them. Some of the weapons show very little damage output compared to their cost, as the purples show us very clearly. The Bettina, but especially the Bobcat and Tempest, show very little performance compared to how much they cost to craft. And this is even more the case for the legendary weapons, which are arguably angled more as PvE weapons than PvP weapons, but it's still quite interesting. Now, if we look only at the time to kill of tier 4 weapons and compare that to the cost, then the Kettle, Stitcher, and Rattler top the list, all very cheap guns, so cheap that even the Rattler does decently. The Berletta and Venator follow, as they have solid time to kills, the Venator the fastest time to kill in the game against medium shields, which is what's carrying it. Same with the Torrente, the really fast time to kill is making it earn its price. The Tempest really shows a weakness here though, as it's the worst purple at justifying the crafting cost. The Pharaoh does even worse. For a 30th of the price, it isn't even beating the legendaries, which are the by far most expensive weapons to craft. Some weapons clearly have a lot of performance for very little money at tier 1, like the Stitcher, the Kettle, and to an extent even the Rattler and the Berletta, but when we increase the overall cost of the weapons by upgrading them to tier 4, where they are also the strongest, it evens out a lot more. The Stitcher and Kettle are still very strong, as they are very cheap to craft and upgrade, but they do fall off more as a lot of the other weapons have their damage improved by being upgraded to tier 4, while the Stitcher and Kettle have the same damage output as they did at tier 1. Now initially I wanted to just score an overall winner for this video, but when I got to this point in the video I realized that because we are comparing all these different weapons against each other across almost every stat in the game, setting up a single overall score is pretty difficult to do in a fair way. And this is mainly because we are comparing weapons of very different types directly to each other, like shotguns, pistols, SMGs, sniper rifles, LMGs, and even energy weapons are all being compared in the same way, when they are very different weapon types and have very different uses. So we'll create an overall score for the sake of it, but I wouldn't read too much into that one, as we'll pick out certain stats to build some more specific scenario and playstyle focused scores to see how weapons compare in certain gameplay situations and how they might complement specific playstyles. So in addition to the overall best weapon, we are also going to look at the best PvP meta, both for close range and long range, the best PvPvE weapon, meaning the most versatile across PvP and against Arc, which is the PvE in this game, the best economy choice comparing performance to price, and the best for looting comparing performance to weight. The scores in these different categories are going to be based on normalized scores for the weapons from various stats that we have gone through in this video. This meaning they get scored from 0 to 1 based on how they perform relative to other weapons in a given stat. And then we summarize the 0.1 scores from the different stats we've chosen into a final score. While I will base everything on objective numbers, I will obviously have my own subjective opinions and preferences, and in order to compile these scores, I have had to weigh the different stats differently in order to try and reflect their actual impact on gameplay. The weight of a weapon is arguably not as important as its time to kill for the PvP meta score, for example. So the way I have chosen to weigh these stats is based on the importance I see the stat having, as I have no other way to do this in a more objective way, at least not easily available to me. So take it with a pinch of salt, because while I've tried to weigh everything fairly, you might have a different preference or a different opinion on what's important in a weapon, which would have likely shifted the results. So take the results results in the context of the weighing that I have given each of the stats. And this is also why I've spent the video going into the stats and exploring each of them, so that we can expose the strengths or weaknesses that might get lost in an overall score. Let's start by looking at the overall winner first, which is the best across most of the stats from this video. We'll include damage, DPS, fire rate, shots to kill, time to kill, reload vulnerability, arc penetration, range, weight, moddability, agility, stealth, and cost, as we'll try to include the most stats possible to create an actual overall score. And these will be weighed a bit differently to try and reflect their impact, including multiple stats that focus on damage, like time to kill, DPS and fire rate, etc., because that allows us to get a well-rounded score for the weapons, allowing different situational strengths to shine, like one weapon having low DPS, but hitting like a truck with high per-shot damage, for example. Time to kill will be a combined stat averaged from head and body shot time to kill against all 3 shield types, and headshot time to kill against all 3 shield types. Weighed 15% from headshot time to kill and 5% from body and headshot time to kill. This allows us to emphasize headshots more than body shots, which also allows the headshot modifier of each weapon to have a little bit more impact. And headshots is what you go for in a fight and ideally hit. DPS is at 10% of total, as it's important, also in PvE, and can matter outside of time to kill, as time to kill looks only at the ideal, while DPS gives us more of a general stat. Shot to kill is also included at 2.5%, as it's kind of included in time to kill, but should have some impact on its own. We have also included per shot damage at 7.5%, so that it, in conjunction with shots to kill, can represent the power of hard-hitting weapons. Fire rate is included at 10% because of its suppressing effect of sorts, and the fact that it negates the vulnerability between shots, as well as it giving you the bullet coverage for landing more potential killing shots. Range is included at 10%, which I think is even kind of too much, mainly because I don't really think the range stat is perfectly relative. It seems quite exaggerated, and it doesn't tell us anything about the actual ballistics of how the gun functions at range, like muzzle velocity, accuracy, etc. So I don't want to weigh it more than that, as I think it's kind of flawed, but we also don't have anything else to go off in regards to ranged performance. Agility is weighed at 10%, it's important for quick and accurate shots, and is good for weapon swaps. Reload vulnerability will be scored on a combined reload vulnerability score from when you're using a tier 4 weapon with a tier 3 extended mag, and you're just using a tier 4 weapon without an extended mag. And it is 5% of total, which I think is reflective. It's impactful, but it will be something you actively play around and stay aware of. Moddability is weighed at 2.5%, minor impact on the reason to pick up a weapon, but it's nice to have. Weight is the same, also weighed at 2.5% of total. Arc penetration is included with the average score of arc pen versus per shot damage, and arc pen versus DPS at 7.5% of the score. It's very important, but nowhere near the main reason you'll pick up a gun. Cost is included at 5% as it's relatively minor, and stealth is also at 2.5% as it's arguably even less important. Now for the results. The Venator wins thanks to its immensely fast time to kill, solid DPS at tier 4, and good to great performance across the board, with the Stitcher close behind. And the Stitcher, thanks to some of the same overall performance, but it is being carried by its cost and how cheap it is. The Volcano is just a powerhouse in terms of damage, which is very much what carries it to third place. The Beretta also having a lot of firepower with a good weight and cost. The Bobcat and the Kettle place on either side of the Beretta, the Kettle with its great headshot time to kill and low cost, and the Bobcat with its good headshot time to kill but even better body shot time to kill relative to other weapons. Anvil is about middle of the list along with the Arpeggio being at best just okay across the different stats, while the Anvil at the very least performs very strong in some of these stats. The Osprey is placing okay, it's strong in certain stats, but it's arguably quite niche in actual gameplay, but impressive placing considering it's a sniper rifle. The Tempest and Bettina place pretty poorly for being purple quality weapons. The El Toro gets its placing mainly just because of its very strong per shot damage, but not being the greatest in terms of any of the other statistics. The Renegade is also quite low, it doesn't really perform that well across the board, and has even fewer stats where it excels than, for example, the Anvil. The Bettina is very disappointing as it's personally a gun I kinda like, but while I think it's strong when used in specific situations, it does suffer from a pretty low damage per shot and a fire rate that isn't high enough to carry that low damage, meaning it's only decent on DPS and time to kill, but also because of its small magazine size that you cannot improve by upgrading the weapon nor by using extended mags because it doesn't have an extended magazine slot, which could have been a nice addition in Bark. The other low performers are the legendary weapons, but as I mentioned earlier in the video, they are seemingly aimed much more towards being PvE weapons rather than PvP weapons, so this is not the most surprising result. They have their use for PvE, but that's kind of about it. The Pharaoh and the Hairpin are the last two we haven't mentioned yet, and these are also no real surprise placing this low, with each of them only having a few good things going for them, one of them having high per shot damage and one being the stealthiest option in the game, with both of them being quite cheap. When we look at the tier 1 overall score, the Stitcher is actually the best, followed by the Berletta and the Bobcat, with the Volcano in 4th and the Kettle as the second grey in 5th. The Venator drops down to 7th place, falling just behind the Torrente in 6th, and this is mainly because of the Venator's drop in fire rate from tier 4 to tier 1, and it's the same with most of the other weapons that are dropping down the list compared to their tier 4 placings. They are now missing their fire rate increase from being upgraded, and some are also missing their reload time reductions from upgrades. And this is very noticeable, especially with the Anvil and the Renegade, which drop even lower than their already not so great placing. The Bettina and Tempest see a small jump up the list, thanks to them being relatively strong at tier 1, while the legendary weapons with the Hairpin and the Pharaoh still sit at the bottom. Now for the best PvP weapon, here's how we'll score it. We'll base it 20% off of headshot time to kill, 20% off of headshot and body shot time to kill, 10% from per shot damage, 5% from DPS, 10% from reload vulnerability, 15% from agility, and 20% from range. We're not really going to care about the cost, the weight, the arc penetration, etc. of the weapons, as we are just after their performance in the central PvP statistics. Here, the tier 4 weapons are going to consider reload vulnerability only with an extended mag, as if you are after the meta, you're not going to be skimping on an extended mag. For the tier 4 weapons, we see the Venator on top. Still, after its nerf, it's the best overall PvP weapon. The Volcano is second, while its range stat isn't the greatest, its damage output is incredible, but important to note that it is a shotgun, so it will not be as versatile in gameplay. The Bobcat is placing third, overall a very strong gun in PvP, with its weakest points being range and magazine size. The Kettle is fourth, with its insane headshot time to kill for a very low cost. The Berletta is actually placing 5th, quite interestingly. I do think it's getting carried by its high agility and its high ideal fire rate. The Stitcher follows, then the Torrente, Tempest, and Arpeggio, with the Anvil being quite middle of the pack, and the Bettina is placing as the worst purple weapon. If we look at tier 1, it changes a little bit. The Berletta is now on top, along with the Stitcher and Bobcat at 2nd and 3rd. All of these in the top 3 have their highest fire rate available all the way from tier 1, which is very much helping them here. The Venator is now 4th as it's missing 40% of its fire rate compared to tier 4. The Torrente also stays high up, having its fire rate also all the way from tier 1, and as we've talked about earlier, the fire rate is the only real way to improve the time to kill of a weapon in arc raiders, besides just hitting more headshots. Now, I don't want to dwell on this PvP score too much, as there are two main types of engagements that you will engage in a third-person shooter like Arc Raiders. You will have close-range fights, which are mostly head-to-head combat, where you or someone else swings on the other to take a decisive engagement. And then you also have long-range fights, where you will instead jiggle peek from behind cover, trying to damage and wear down an enemy to drain their resources, before you push closer to force that decisive close combat engagement, unless you are able to end it from range before that is even necessary. So let's try to narrow in our best PvP weapon a little bit more. Let's first look at which weapons do best in close combat. Now, we're not going to look at the range stat for this, because a low range stat doesn't mean it's a good close range weapon, it just means it's not suited for long range fights. So we'll look at time to kill, averaged for only headshots across all shield types, as we are trying to see the fastest potential time to kill in close quarters, where headshots are arguably the easiest to hit. Not really going to care too much about the shots to kill here, as it's indirectly included in the time to kill. We also don't really care about how many shots it takes to kill someone in close combat, just how fast we can kill them. We also don't look at DPS because we're already looking at time to kill, which kind of covers it, but we will include Firerate as it provides its suppressive effect, as well as it providing better bullet coverage, meaning that as most players don't hit every bullet in a fight, you will have a lot more opportunities to land the killing shot first if you have a higher Firerate. We'll also include reload vulnerability and agility, and we'll weigh the stats like this. Now, the way we set up the formula here is to make a combined normalized 0 to 1 score for all the different stats. Then we multiply them with the normalized headshot time to kill score. And that allows us to see the total score through the lens of the headshot time to kill, as that is by far the most important metric in head-to-head close combat. For the tier 4 weapons, again the Venator tops, it's just a beast, but the Stitcher is close behind, same with the Berletta and Bobcat. The Kettle is also very high up, having one of the fastest headshot time to kills in the game, carrying it. If you can hit your headshots and avoid reloads, the Kettle is pretty solid. The Torrente is also very strong, and then there is a step down to the Volcano and Tempest. The Volcano has a massive DPS and per shot damage, but because it doesn't have a headshot multiplier, it loses out to weapons that benefit more from headshots. Same with the Tempest, as it has only a 1.5 times headshot multiplier. With tier 1 weapons, the Stitcher and Bobcat top the list as they have some of the fastest time to kill at tier 1, thanks to their high base fire rate. The Berletta is also a strong choice here, and we see the Kettle jump up the list, same with the Torrente, as they also have their max fire rate all the way from tier 1. The Venator again drops when it's compared at tier 1, so it's definitely evident that if you want to use the Venator, it's a good idea to upgrade it. The Tempest sees a slight jump, not having an amazing time to kill, but not needing to be upgraded to have its fastest time to kill helps it out here. The Anvil drops pretty hard, losing its 75% faster fire rate, and that is not doing it any good for close range combat. But we also have the long range PvP to consider, and for that we'll look at the shots to kill averaged for body shots and headshots for all 3 shield types, but we'll also include time to kill here, also averaged for body and headshots across the shields, as it still matters how fast we can deliver the shots to kill, but we are more likely to hit more body shots when at further ranges. Fire rate is not of the same importance here, neither is reload vulnerability, but instead magazine size compared to shots to kill at a 60% accuracy and 50% headshot ratio is a stat that we will include to show how much headroom you have for missing shots within a single magazine and still get the kill. The stats here will be weighed like this, and here we are going to look through the lens of the ranged score instead of the headshot time to kill like we did with close combat. Because what does good stats matter for long range PvP if you can't hit anything at range? For tier 4, the Osprey just dominates. It has the best range stat in the game thanks to its very fast and accurate bullets. It has a good and lenient magazine size. It also has a low average shots to kill at just 3 and a pretty decent time to kill. The Renegade follows with a big magazine, good range stat, and good damage and time to kill. The Aphelion and Jupiter, the Battle and Sniper Rifle legendaries follow that again, having very strong range stats as they have almost instant bullet travel thanks to being energy weapons and seem very accurate. They also have pretty decent damage, but the Aphelion scores a lot better than the Jupiter as it does have a much better time to kill. The Jupiter has one of the worst time to kills in the game, but it does only have a 3-shot average shot to kill. The Anvil is very strong here as well for the more not so typical long range weapon types, high per shot damage, low shots to kill, and a pretty decent range stat. The Venator is back though, placing surprisingly high. It has almost the same range stat as the Anvil, so it's placing pretty well here, relatively low shots to kill and a decent damage per shot. The Pharaoh follows, being high damage per shot like the Anvil, slightly better range stat than the Venator, but with a very slow time to kill. We find the Bettina and the Tempest quite low despite being rifles. You would expect them to place a little bit higher, but they have higher shots to kill. None of them have an amazing time to kill either, and while they have good range stat, it's not enough to carry them. The bottom consists majorly of the Grace, the Berletta, Bobcat, and the shotguns, which is kind of to be expected. Now if we compare this to tier 1, there is quite a lot of changes. The Bettina climbs the list, so does the Equalizer. The Bettina only has a 15% fire rate increase at tier 4, so it doesn't lose that much time to kill going to its tier 1 base fire rate. The Anvil places exactly the same, as while its time to kill drops, it still has a 2-shot to kill. The Osprey and Renegade are in the top, but the Renegade loses second place to the Aphelion, dropping down to 4th. The legendary weapons have the same stats for tier 1 as tier 4, as they can't be upgraded, so they will perform here better just thanks to that. The Venator and Arpeggio drop down the list, as they lose their vital fire rate increase. In terms of pure PvE, the Hullcracker is obviously the best choice, but is far too unique to be compared to the rest of the weapons. So for now, it's just going to remain in a league of its own, and it rather deserves its own video. And that video would have just been comparing the other weapons' PvE abilities to the Hullcracker anyways. Before the other weapons, we can try to find the best option if our goal is to be able to take out arc enemies in addition to regular PvP. We very much saw the best weapon exclusively for arc in the arc penetration part of the video, so I would refer to that part if you want the pure PvE option, but we can look for the best PvPvE weapon by comparing its normalized performance score for PvP to its normalized performance against arc. So here we compare the headshot time to kill and the overall time to kill for the pure PvP performance with agility, reload vulnerability, and range, weighed like this, to the arc performance score. And the arc performance score is averaged from both arc penetration compared to per shot damage and arc penetration compared to DPS. The Equalizer tops as the best PvPvE option. It has poor to okay PvP performance, but with very solid arc performance. The Anvil comes in as second, having very decent PvP performance across the board, and also being very strong against arc, especially in per shot damage. The Aphelion also places just below the Anvil, as it has the advantage of hitting hard per shot, but also has a higher fire rate than the Jupiter, so it manages some pretty decent PvP performance. The Bettina is fairly middle of the pack in terms of PvP, but is a heavy ammo weapon, so it has some good performance against arc. The Venator isn't actually the worst PvE weapon, as it and the rest of the medium ammo weapons do perform decently against arc. And it's also arguably the best PvP weapon, as we have found in the previous scorings. Going to tier 1, there are some interesting changes. The Bettina climbs a bit while the Anvil drops. The Anvil, despite its tier 1 PvP performance being a lot worse than its tier 4 PvP performance, it doesn't drop too far, as it has really good PvE arc performance that is very much carrying it. The Tempest performs better as well, mostly just thanks to other weapons dropping more than it does. Its arc performance isn't terrible either though, and it has the same DPS and time to kill at tier 1 as it does at tier 4. The Renegade drops a couple of spots thanks to this exact reason, that it's losing its massive fire rate increase and mag size increase from tier 4. Its high per shot damage with decent arc penetration is what's keeping it from dropping further. For the Cheapo's choice, or the economy choice, where the thing you mainly care about is being able to get a kill, to trade up into a decent loadout and then snowball from there, or you're just trying to make money or quest and don't want to risk anything major, but still want to be able to put a raider down should you have to. We do have free kits, but you might want a little bit more agency than shooting from the hip, trusting the loadout gods. We'll include damage, DPS, fire rate, time to kill, and we'll include reload vulnerability, arc performance, and range, and we'll compare it all to the cost of the weapon. And at tier 4, the Stitcher has the best performance, with the Kettle at number 2, and we can see the list very much follows the quality of weapons. And that is mainly because, as we discussed in the cost section, guns are fairly closely balanced across the qualities, but the qualities have massive differences in cost, which makes the cost very consequential for how the weapons perform in this score. But the Anvil does punch well above its green quality. The worst performing green is the Arpeggio, which is quite a bit more expensive than the other greens, not making it back in terms of performance though. The Venator performs the best of the blue weapons, but the Osprey and Torrente isn't far behind. And for the tier 1, the Torrente is actually the third best, which, yeah, in my experience, running the Torrente tier 1 on Stella Montis against free kits is 100% accurate. The Renegade is the worst blue for the cost, but that's in terms of very general PvP, and it's still only middle of the list. The Tempest and the Bobcat perform pretty poorly as the worst purple weapons. The legendaries lose outright though, no surprise, as they are very expensive to make. The Stitcher and Kettle are still at the top with the tier 1 weapon comparison, but the Torrente, like I mentioned, is a beast compared with tier 1 weapons compared to its cost. The Beretta and Rattler, the Rattler of all guns, also don't do that bad, and actually beats out the Venator considering the Rattler is dirt cheap. The Renegade and Anvil both drop quite hard. Again, they are so dependent on their fire rate increase from being upgraded. The Bettina and the other purples do climb quite hard, as they are not as costly now that they don't need to be upgraded from tier 1, and do mostly have their strongest damage potential available from tier 1, or don't gain that much from being upgraded to tier 4 compared to the other weapons. For the looter's choice, we are going to include damage, DPS, fire rate, time to kill, reload vulnerability, arc performance, and range, and we'll also include the Moddability, as a weapon with more mod slots can put any attachments we loot onto that weapon, and we'll compare that to the weight of the weapon. For the tier 4 weapons, the Venator tops thanks to its immense statistical performance combined with it just weighing 5 kilos. The fact that this gun used to be even better and used to weigh 2 kilos unmodded should really tell you how unbalanced it was at launch. The Beretta and Anvil, also pistols, are 2nd and 4th, the Stitcher at 3rd as it's also 5 kilograms, but it doesn't have quite the same overall performance as the others. The Osprey is surprisingly quite good here at 5th. It does have some strong PvP performance, mainly at range like we saw earlier, but it's also quite light at just 7 kilos, just 2 more than a Venator. The rest of the greys do kind of okay in this. The Bobcat and Volcano sit just above the middle of the list, with the Tempest and Bettina really struggling, as they're heavier and they don't come with the best PvP performance. The Torrente and Equalizer, being the LMGs, lose this outright though, so a good idea to pair them with a good augment or some good skill choices if you plan on running them. If we look at the tier 1 weapons, then the Stitcher actually takes the top spot, as the Venator drops in performance compared to its tier 4 version, but it's still strong enough to get a healthy 3rd place. A lot of the rest of the lead is fairly similar. The Bobcat climbs a lot though, having a really strong PvP potential at tier 1. It is beaten by the Rattler, somehow. Maybe the Rattler is just a bit underrated after all. The Osprey and Arpeggio drop on the list as they get some fire rate reductions when compared to tier 4. The Hairpin is actually also performing pretty decent, and it has the added advantage of being the only integrally suppressed gun and having the best stealth score in the game. So for some closing thoughts, the Kettle has really surprised me, scoring surprisingly well across the overall general PvP and close range PvP categories, as well as almost winning the Cheapo's choice, thanks mainly to its pretty insane headshot time to kill. The Venator though is just something else. If it performs this well on paper now, you can easily understand why people rightfully called it broken before it got nerfed. It's just so strong in time to kill, but also in per shot damage and in shots to kill it's also good, making it strong even when pure time to kill isn't the decider. It's got a good magazine size with access to extended mags. It's got a little bit of a downside in that it can't be modded much to your preference, but arguably it's also an upside that it performs this well while not relying on attachments to do it. The Stitcher and Beretta also go hard in PvP, performing decent on the overall score, and even being really strong in the Looter's choice, as well as the Stitcher winning Cheapo's choice. The Arpeggio is also struggling so much, which I wasn't really expecting. The Anvil also deserves a little bit of a mention, as it scores just okay in the overall PvP and close range PvP, but it does really well in long range, and is arguably the best PvPvE weapon by quite a distance, besides the legendary weapons. The Tempest has been a real disappointment. I was really expecting it to place better, but I think it's just appealing to me and my playstyle, but on paper it does struggle in most categories. Mainly because it just doesn't do anything really well, it just kinda does everything okay. The most disappointing one for me personally is probably the Renegade, mainly just doing well on ranged PvP, and it's decent for PvPvE. I think this is mainly because the range stat just isn't the best, and I believe the Renegade would get a more fair run if we could more accurately reward its ranged performance with more accurate and telling stats. It is, in my opinion, probably the best ranged weapon in the game thanks to its incredible power in jiggle peaks, but when we consider a lot of other factors for the guns, it just doesn't perform that well. It's also weighed down by its very long full reload time, as it's hard to account for some of the weapons being loaded individually, while others are magazine loaded, and still being able to compare them fairly to each other. So arguably, the Renegade, Anvil, Toro, and Rattler should all have been performing at the very least slightly better if I was better at math. But that's all I had for this video. I know, right? Finally. That's a long time coming. It took a long time. So if you watched this video, even just in part, I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.